Our second and final panel session for today has a particular accent on human capital. We understand that human capital is at the heart of any healthy economy and that education, training and health provide the most important keys to unlocking the human capital. In this discussion, it's worth remembering a couple of relevant statistics from the State of Tropics report, as Sandra Harding highlighted this morning, that by 2050, half the world's population, including 67% of the world's children, are expected to live in the tropics. Secondly, more than two-thirds of the world's poor live in the tropics, and more people experience undernourishment in the tropics than in the rest of the world. To offer a global perspective for this panel, I'm joined now by Professor Graeme Hugo, Professor of Geography and Director of the Australian Population and Migration Research Centre at the University of Adelaide. He's authored countless books, articles and journals, and his research interests revolve around population issues in Australia and Southeast Asia. Graeme Hugo. Warren Mundine is a high-profile Aboriginal leader who is currently the chair of the Australian Government's Indigenous Advisory Council. He's also chair of the Australian Indigenous Education Council and the Australian Indigenous Chamber of Commerce. He's managing director of the Nyanga Black, which offers strategic business advice. Would you welcome Warren Mundine? Professor Nye Brown was one of the first Aboriginal medical graduates in Australia. She's completed a Masters in Public Health and Tropical Medicine, is currently undergoing doctoral research in Aboriginal child protection. Nye is Professor of Indigenous Health at Wollongong University and in 2005 was named the AMA Woman in Medicine. She also serves on the National Government's Indigenous Advisory Council. Nye Brown. I'm first going to invite Graeme Hugo to open the session, and he's coming at it from the particular perspective of demographics.
Well, thanks very much, Kerry, and I must say it's an honour to be involved in this very important meeting. As you heard, I'm a demographer. I study human populations, and I think too often in discussions of development, such as we're having about the tropics in Australia currently, population is seen as some sort of static backdrop against which economic, environmental and social forces are played out. The fact is that population is dynamic. It isn't simply a function of the economy. It's very much influenced by a number of structural elements. What I want to do today is to say a little bit about the context, the Australian demographic context, because I think there's significant misrepresentation of what's happening in Australia's population. But I then want to focus particularly on the North, because the North has a very distinctive population, and I think in any discussions of economic development into the future, that population is absolutely crucial. The human resources of a region are very, very valuable. And I'll finish up by looking at some future scenarios and some policy implications. As a demographer, I study trends in the changing size, distribution and composition of populations. And what I've done with my group in Adelaide is to take the region north of the Tropic of Capricorn, and we've been doing a number of intensive pieces of work, not just looking at the existing population, but looking at a number of potential scenarios which could underlie developments into the future. As I said before, population really is a very important resource. We know about the great physical and natural resources of the North, but its existing population is crucial to any future discussions. I believe that population interventions too often talk about only bringing in people from the outside, and that's very important. But any sort of population initiatives in this region must begin with the development of the people that are already here. There are a number of myths about population. The fact is, it's suggested it's not amenable to policy intervention. In fact, it is. We have many examples around the world, particularly in recent times, of where population policy has been a very useful adjunct to economic development. There are also some myths, and I've heard them particularly stated in relation to the north. Build it and they will come. I'm afraid it doesn't happen that way, and the recent experience of Darwin with the massive demand for jobs there and their attempts to lure people from Melbourne, even people displaced from the manufacturing industry, have largely failed. We do need a coherent population policy. Just looking at in terms of the Australian situation, I sometimes hear it that our population is growing slowly, some people even suggesting that it's static. In fact, currently there are only 3 Asian countries who have a population growing faster than Australia's. At 1.8% per annum, it is a very rapidly growing population. And in the north, at well over 2%, that is even faster. So we're dealing already with significant growth of the population. What I want to do is just look at the components of population growth. We usually look at it in terms of natural increase, or births minus deaths, and net migration, the excess of in-migration over out-migration. And in this diagram I show for Australia the 2 components, natural increase at the bottom and migration at the top since World War II. And you can notice that natural increase has been fairly stable, whereas migration has been much more volatile, subject to economic trends and political policy. Now, in this region, they're split more or less equally between natural increase and net migration. We hear a lot about migration, but the natural increase dimension does tend to be neglected, yet it is responsible for half the growth of the region. And I want to just focus on that natural increase element, mortality and fertility. In my lifetime, we've added 13 years of life to the average Australian, which is a massive achievement. This graph just shows the increase in life expectancy over the last 120 years or so, and indicates that currently a baby born today, if it's male, would age to about 80 if mortality trends were maintained, current mortality trends were maintained throughout their lifetime. For a girl, about 84. Now, what I want to look at is not so much expectation of life at birth, but something quite remarkable has happened in Australia over the last 30 or 40 years. And that's looking at not so much expectation of life at birth, but how long could one expect to live if you get through to age 50. Now, when I raise this with my first-year class of 18-year-olds, this gets very little attention, but I must say that it's some set of statistics that I look at with more interest each year when they come out. What they show is something quite incredible, that between 1900 and 1970, we added only 2 years of extra life to the average Australian at age 50. But since then, we've added 9 years of extra life. In other words, when my dad turned 50 and when I turned 50, I could look forward to 9 years of extra life compared to my father. Now, 9 years extra, you add that up across 3 million Australians aged over 65. That is a massive amount of extra person years, which wasn't anticipated in our planning in the past. And it lays behind a lot of the discussions about increasing participation in the workforce, increasing the retirement age and so on. But it represents a very substantial change. What about fertility? And fertility over the last 100 years, and this is a diagram of the total fertility rate, or the average number of babies that women are having. And you can see the decline in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, and then the post-war baby boom, when my mother's generation had almost 4 babies on average. Now, that baby boom in Australia was longer and greater than any baby boom of any country in the world, and it's put an indelible mark on our demography. Currently, a third of our workforce are baby boomers, and they'll be leaving that workforce over the next 20 or 30 years, creating very, very significant demands for workers. But Australia is a country of migration. Half of us are a migrant or the child of a migrant. Now, you often hear that the United States is a country of migration. The equivalent figure there is 18% are a first or a second generation migrant. So we are dominated by our post-war migration. In fact, our population would be about 13 million instead of 23 million if it wasn't for that migration. Currently, the Bureau of Statistics is projecting we'll get a population of about 38 million by 2050. But I have to stress that that is not a prediction, it is a projection. It's saying that will happen if things keep going the way they are now. And to demonstrate that in this slide, I put the figures for the previous two sets of projections done by the Bureau of Statistics at a time of lesser population growth, and they of course come up with quite lower projected figures. Now, what about the North? The North's demography is quite distinctively different. You can see there that it has about 5% of the national population, but importantly, in terms of the Indigenous population, it's about half and half between northern and southern Australia, and hence one of the elements in any attempt to expand northern development, the Indigenous population must play, I think, a very, very significant role. It has a disproportionately low proportion of international migrants, although they're increasing. It has more males than females compared to the southern part of Australia, where women outnumber men. Now, in terms of migration, because migration undoubtedly from other parts of Australia to northern Australia has to be significant. And what I've shown here is the last census results on the number of people moving in and the number of people moving out, which is quite substantial. But if you put it all together, there was only a net gain of 4,000 people in the north from the south. So a pretty small contribution to overall population growth. Similarly, with international migration, we've seen a very significant increase in migration for the nation as a whole and in the north, but it still represents a relatively small number. One of the things, though, that this data does, which is that it tends to not take into account temporary migration. And I'd argue that the north is more influenced by temporary movements, both internal and international, than the south in Australia. And this means that I think the official statistics underestimate the population at any one time in the north. But also I think it says something too about a very high turnover of population in the north and what the implications that is for community development and for economic development more generally. And I think that is certainly one of the challenges which we face. So what we have is relatively small net migration, though together the internal and the international migration makes up half of the population growth. Just a couple of things about the characteristics. The population of the north is younger. It has a demographic dividend in that it has a very high proportion of its population concentrated in the most productive young age groups, more so than in the south. And this is something that I think can be built upon in any economic development plan. I just have a number of characteristics in the paper, but I don't have time to go through them all now, but I'm happy to make them available to you. But what I do look at is things like the income structure, where the average income tends to be higher in the north, the family structure, where there is a greater representation of singles and couples as opposed to family households. And you can see occupation, industry, income and so on. Just a little about the spatial distribution, because any of the major plans for the north is going to be fairly strongly urban based, and the urban infrastructure at the moment is relatively limited, with only 3 settlements with more than 100,000 people in them, in Cairns, Townsville and Darwin. And I think this is often lost in some of the discussion, that the urban concentration of any major population increase is going to be quite relevant. What about the future? Now, there have been some quite incredible numbers spoken about in terms of increasing the population of the north. And people point to cities in China which have grown massively. Shenzhen from 30,000 in 1990 to a population now which is about the same as the population of all of Australia in that one city. But that doesn't happen very easily. And if we look at the Bureau of Statistics projections for the next couple of intercensual periods, you can see that what we're looking at best is a population gain of about 250,000 each of the 5-year periods, and this is the official ABS projections. And to increase it above that would take a very substantial effort in terms particularly of internal but more importantly in terms of international migration. And this has to be planned. It can't happen just by building things and expecting people to come. It has to be an integrated approach to those policies. We've looked at a number of potential possible scenarios of population growth, but I think a lot more work would need to be done on that if there are significant plans for expanding the population of the region. It will take the introduction of new international migration visas, I believe, and I had some suggestions about the types of visas which might be involved. A number of the issues which I think do need to be considered in a population policy for the north is the one that I mentioned earlier relating to temporary inflows of people through fly-in, fly-out, but also in a whole range of other areas where both international and internal migrants, many of them don't settle down in the communities of the north. They tend to move through those areas, and I think there has to be a objective of building up families and building up communities on the basis of what is already there. What I would argue is that any economic plan for the future needs to have, as part of that plan, some population planning, in where there is a fitting of that population policy to the labour needs and the skill needs of the north. One of the things which we noticed in looking at the skill profile of the north is a really distinct lack of many skilled areas, particularly in engineering and a number of areas which would be likely to be necessary if northern development was to be considerably expanded. In terms of that population policy, to me a significant part has to look at the existing population, a very important part of which would be the Indigenous communities as well, and working out a role in which there may be some redeployment, retraining, a whole range of opportunities. And I think it's all too easy to overlook the potential of the existing population in the light of migration. I suggest a number of internal migration possibilities. The report released last week, I think, had a very interesting suggestion that there may be a HEX waiver or a HEX reduction for young graduates who undertake to go for a significant period to work in the north. And I think that's the type of innovative policy which does need to be looked at, because the reality is, and a recent Productivity Commission report showed quite clearly how Australian labour is not very spatially mobile. Even and especially among people displaced from manufacturing in Melbourne and Adelaide and so on, have got very little capacity to move long distances, because many are middle-aged, they've got mortgages, they've got children in schools and so on. So we are going to have to come up with innovative ways of affecting that redistribution of population. With respect to international migration, I think that there are some quite exciting possibilities. For some time now, we've had the state-specific and regional migration schemes, which I think have been very successful. They now account for 1 in 5 migrants coming to Australia. And I think for the northern development to be successful, we would need to look at some specific visa categories which are targeted directly at the north. And I just want to draw attention to the trend which is occurring right across the Western world, in Canada, in North America, in USA, in Europe. The fact is that whereas in the past virtually all migrants have settled in gateway cities, they are increasingly moving to regional areas. And they're moving to regional areas because of the need for workers in those areas. In Australia now, 20% of migrants live in regional areas, whereas it was much lower just a decade ago. And so that it may well be that whereas it's going to be difficult to encourage internal migrants to move from the south to the north, innovative and effective use of international migration is actually building on existing spontaneous processes to affect settlement in the north. Just in conclusion, I think there is a real danger, and looking through a lot of the existing documentation on the north, that the people issue has been in the background. It's been an assumption, the fact that if we build things, people will come. It's not that easy, and it's certainly not in the best interests of the north for it to be left to chance. A population plan, a population policy, shouldn't be a standalone thing. You don't have it as a totally separate operation, but it does need to be integrated with economic planning for the region. And that plan must have as a central component building on the existing human resources living within the area, and that should always be the basis of a future population plan. I've rushed through a bit of that, but I'm very happy to provide the full paper to anyone that would like it. Thank you.
Thanks, Graeme. When we come to the discussion, I'm one of those who are old enough to remember when Gough Whitlam tried to decentralise from the major capital cities, and I'd be curious to hear what lessons you think there are to be learned from that.